"You should go, Delia. We'll sort the paperwork in the morning." Rafferty Crest, 43-year-old founder of Crest Development Group, said it quietly, as if he were asking her to step away from a conversation that no longer required her. In his left hand was a sealed envelope from his family solicitor. Behind him stood Harriet Crest, 69-year-old mother of Rafferty, and the woman who had spent 11 years treating her son's marriage like a temporary accommodation. And near the doorway of the side library, one hand resting on the door frame and a champagne flute in the other, stood Yolanda Bryce, 31-year-old brand director of Crest Development Group. The woman Rafferty had been careful never to stand too close to at public events. Delia Harmon Crest, 37, wife of Rafferty, stood in the center of the room with the guest welcome folders. She had spent 3 days preparing pressed against her chest. Through the paneled walls, she could hear the anniversary gala continuing. 200 guests, the string quartet, the clink of glasses, conversations about square footage and market projections. She had designed the evening. She had corrected the investor deck at 2 in the morning when Rafferty submitted it with 3 wrong figures. She had called the caterers herself when the original vendor pulled out 4 days before the event. She had arranged for the lighting company to be paid early because she knew the accounts payable team was running slow. None of that was in the room now. Harriet extended one hand. Her rings caught the light. "Your keycard for Thornfield, please." Her voice carried the politeness of someone who had already made a decision and was merely waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. "The trustees feel it is best if you take some time away while Rafferty and the family determine next steps." Delia looked at the card in her jacket pocket. Thornfield House, the estate in Callerton, where she had spent 11 years managing staff schedules, correcting maintenance logs, covering emergency repairs out of her own accounts because the household budget was perpetually short. She had repainted the East Wing herself 3 years ago, hired the crew, approved the colors, oversaw the work, because no one else was going to. She gave Harriet the key card. There was no point in holding it. Yolanda had moved a step further into the room. She was wearing a dress the color of old cream and jewelry that Delia had last seen inside the locked drawer of her own vanity. A strand of freshwater pearls, a gift from Delia's mother, kept separate from the household pieces because they had never belonged to the Crest name. They were not Rafferty's to give or take. Delia looked at the pearls once. Then she looked at Rafferty. He looked at the floor. "The settlement documents will come by courier," Harriet continued. "Read them carefully, and let's not make this unpleasant for anyone." Delia picked up her bag from the side table and walked to the door. Rafferty's voice found her before she reached it. "Don't be difficult about this, Delia. You know how these things go." She turned once. "I do," she said. "Better than you think." The gala was still warm and bright when she walked through it. A server near the champagne tower, Brent, 22, who had worked 3 Crest events this year and who had once told her she was the only person on the organizing committee who ever thanked the catering staff, caught her eye as she passed. She said thank you now, automatically. He looked like he didn't know what to do with it. The November air outside hit her before she reached the bottom of the venue steps. She stood on the pavement with one bag, the guest folders, and a clear understanding that the people still inside the building, laughing and toasting 20 years of Rafferty Crest's name, had no idea the woman who had kept that name intact was now standing in the cold. It had started simply enough. In the early years, Rafferty was energetic and undisciplined with money in the way that men who grow up spending it often are. Delia had not pointed this out loudly. She pointed it out once in writing, in a detailed note about the gap between the company's projected revenue and its actual loan service obligations. Rafferty read the first paragraph and told her she was being anxious. She filed the note and covered the shortfall herself quietly through a private account. That became the pattern. A vendor threatening to walk off a project site would find a payment arrive. A subcontractor owed since the previous spring would receive a check marked as an advance from a fund Delia had set up using premarital savings. A lender growing uneasy about a missed covenant would receive a call from Delia, who understood covenant language the way someone trained to read trust documents does, and would be carefully reassured before the situation became a default notice. Rafferty accepted the stability without wondering where it came from. Her father, Vincent Harmon, had warned her about this kind of man years before she met Rafferty. Vincent Harmon, 71-year-old founder of Harmon Meridian Trust, and the man whose name still appeared in the financial histories of every significant development project in southern Ontario from the 1980s onward, had been old-fashioned about almost everything except money. About money he was precise. He had brought Delia into the trust offices on a Saturday morning when she was 24, just after she received her finance designation, and placed a thick binder on the table between them. "Everything I built," he said, "was built on the understanding that lending is an act of judgment, not charity, not performance, judgment." He opened the binder to a column of loan figures and put one finger on a number. "And the most dangerous man you will ever lend to is the one who signs without reading, because he has decided his charm is sufficient collateral." Delia had smiled at the time because she thought he was being theatrical. She understood now that he had been describing the future. When Vincent died, he left controlling interest in Harmon Meridian Trust to a private family trust registered under the Harmon name. The trust documents identified Delia by her maiden name. Board records used Delia Harmon. Regulatory filings named the Harmon Family Trust as the majority beneficiary. And because Rafferty had never asked a single question about her father's estate, not out of respect for her grief, but out of the easy confidence of a man who assumed that whatever a quiet woman inherited was probably not worth tracking, he had signed the premarital disclosure schedule. Vincent's lawyers prepared without reading it. He had called the binder old family bureaucracy, initialed every page in under 4 minutes, and left the meeting to take a phone call. He believed Harmon Meridian Trust had been sold to outside investors years ago. He believed this because no one had corrected him, and it had never occurred to him to ask. What he did not know was that Harmon Meridian Trust held the mortgage financing on 4 of his current projects. The commercial paper on the Lakeview Corridor development, the bridge loan on the warehouse conversion in Brampton, the construction financing on the mixed-use build in Hamilton, and the emergency credit facility he had opened 18 months ago when his primary lender raised concerns about his debt service ratios. He did not know, because Delia had insisted on a strict conflict screen from the beginning. Every file touching Crest Development Group was managed by independent officers without her involvement. She had built that wall herself, not to protect Rafferty, but to protect the trust from any suggestion that her marriage had influenced its lending decisions. If the institution ever had to act against him, the record had to be clean. She had not anticipated that someone in his organization would submit a renewal package with her name on a document she had never signed. The courier arrived at her hotel room the next morning, not with the divorce settlement first as it happened, but with a message from Viveka Raines, 48-year-old Chief Compliance Officer of Harmon Meridian Trust, who had called 3 times before Delia was awake enough to answer. "I know you've asked us to keep you at a distance from Crest files," Viveka said. Her voice was controlled and very careful. "But there is a document in the latest renewal package that has your name on it. A spousal acknowledgement. It states that you were informed of and consented to the collateral arrangements on the Hamilton build." Delia sat up on the edge of the hotel bed. The settlement envelope was still on the desk, unopened. "I never signed anything connected to that file." Viveka's pause said everything. "That is exactly what concerns us." The divorce settlement arrived by courier an hour later. Delia opened it at the small desk beside the window. The language was polished and deliberate, the kind of document designed to look reasonable while being anything but. She was to make no claim on Crest Development assets. She was to waive rights to any examination of company financial records. She was not to contact current staff or board members. And then, near the end, wife acknowledges that she holds no direct or indirect interest in any financial institution or lending entity connected to husband's commercial obligations and waives all rights to review, challenge, or disclose any information relating to same. She read the sentence twice. Then she set the document down and looked out the window at the grey November sky above the parking lot. That clause was not standard language. Standard language in a divorce settlement did not need to specify lending institutions. That specificity was unusual. It meant someone had reason to believe she might know something about those banks, which meant someone in Rafferty's circle knew exactly what they were trying to bury. She picked up her phone and called Mira Selwyn, 45-year-old litigation attorney, and the woman her father had once described as the only lawyer he had ever met who read footnotes with genuine interest. Myra arrived inside 2 hours with a leather briefcase and the particular stillness of someone who had already begun working before she walked through the door. She read the settlement once, then again. She put one finger on the lending clause and looked at Delia. "This is not a divorce agreement," she said. "This is a preemptive confession." They worked through the night. Myra prepared a preservation notice covering every communication, financial record and document touching the Crest household or Delia's father's trust, and sent it to Rafferty's solicitors before morning. If anything was deleted after that timestamp, The deletion would become its own evidence. At Harmon Meridian Trust, Viveka had already convened a preliminary review without Delia's involvement. What the review found was methodical and worse than expected. The question signature on the spousal acknowledgement did not survive comparison with known samples of Delia's handwriting. A forensic analyst noted the pressure was wrong, the hesitation marks inconsistent with natural writing, and the T-crossing in Harmon angled downward, where Delia, trained by her father to sign with an upward stroke, had never crossed it that way in her life. Beyond the signature, there was the collateral. The Hamilton project had listed property valuations. An independent appraiser could not reconcile with comparable sales in the area. The same properties had appeared in a previous renewal package at a figure nearly 40% lower, with no new appraisal attached and no documentation explaining the increase. And then there were the expenses. An auditor found transactions inside the Crest Development operating accounts that did not match their stated business purposes. An apartment in Yorkville, coded as client accommodation. A wardrobe account, coded as brand representation. Private flights charged as regional market visits to cities where Crest had no current projects. Jewelry receipts, including one for a strand of freshwater pearls, coded as a hospitality gift for an unnamed investor contact. Initials on the internal approval forms YB. Viveka called Delia on the second morning. "It is worse than a default situation," she said. "We are looking at possible fraud." Delia stood at the hotel window. She thought about the pearls, about the company account that had paid for them while that same company was running 11 days late on payroll for its site workers. She thought about a woman at the Brampton office, young, working in accounts coordination, who had told her quietly 8 months ago that the Christmas bonuses were going to be short again this year. She thought about what it meant that the people who poured concrete and answered phones and processed invoices had absorbed the cost of someone else's carelessness without ever knowing they were doing it. "Convene the independent review," Delia said. "Full conflict screen. I won't vote on any decision affecting Crest, but the process moves forward according to policy." Viveka said, "Understood, Chairwoman Harmon." The mediation session took place 3 days later in a rented conference room on King Street. Rafferty arrived wearing the expression he used with investors, composed, faintly bored, already planning the next sentence. His solicitor carried the settlement papers like a gift being presented for acceptance. Harriet sat at the side of the table with the authority of someone who had decided the outcome before she entered the room. Yolanda came as well, with no legal standing to be there and no apparent concern about that, and sat close to Rafferty wearing the freshwater pearls. Myra slid the settlement back across the table without opening it. Rafferty looked at Delia. "Let's not make this messier than it needs to be." Myra's voice was even. "Mr. Crest, did your wife ever contribute personal funds to cover Crest Development payroll, vendor obligations, or lender relations during periods when company accounts were insufficient?" A brief glance at his solicitor. "No." Myra wrote it down. Harriet said, "Delia managed the household. That was her role, and she managed it adequately." Myra wrote that down as well. Then Myra turned to Yolanda. "Mrs. Bryce, were company funds ever directed toward your personal expenses, accommodation, clothing, travel, jewelry, or personal items of any kind?" Yolanda's smile was practiced. "Absolutely not. Everything I received was standard professional compensation." Myra wrote it slowly. Every answer was landing in a record that would outlast the certainty with which it had been given. The denied contribution, the dismissed role, the clean hands. Delia reached into her bag and placed the settlement open on the table. "Before we continue, I have a question about one clause." She read the lending institution paragraph aloud. The room was quiet. Rafferty's solicitor said, "Standard language." Delia looked at him. Standard language in a divorce settlement doesn't specify lending institutions unless someone has reason to worry about them. That specificity is unusual. It suggests someone already knew what they were trying to prevent. Rafferty's jaw tightened. "You're reading into things that aren't there." Delia closed the folder. "We'll find out." Prescott Aldane, 51-year-old chief financial officer of Crest Development Group, had come into the room quietly near the start and taken a chair along the wall. He had a folder in front of him that no one had asked him to bring. He said nothing during the session, but Delia noticed him watching the table rather than the people around it, and she understood, without needing to be told, that he had already done his own arithmetic. The board meeting at Harmon Meridian Trust was scheduled for the following Thursday. Viveka arranged the room with the care of someone who understood the minutes would be part of a permanent record. Files sat at every chair, tabbed in red. The screens displayed the Crest development file number. The word review appeared at the top of the agenda in plain text. Rafferty arrived with Prescott and Harriet. He had dressed carefully. He entered the boardroom with the measured confidence of a man who had borrowed against his reputation many times and always found someone willing. He did not look at the nameplate at the head of the table. Then the inner hallway door opened and Delia walked in. Vivica Raines stood. Every Harmon Meridian executive in the room stood. "Good morning, Chairwoman Harmon." Rafferty turned. The color left his face in stages, like a photograph developing in reverse. Harriet went completely still. Prescott closed his eyes briefly, then opened them and slid his folder toward the center of the table, a gesture that said everything about which side he had chosen. Delia walked to the head of the table and sat down. She placed her father's old pen beside the files. She did not look at Rafferty with triumph. She looked at the documents because the documents were what mattered now. Vivica spoke first. Crest Development Group is in covenant breach. 3 of the 4 active loan files contain material omissions. Collateral values submitted for the Hamilton project cannot be reconciled with independent appraisal and are inconsistent with a prior filing from 18 months ago. She paused. A spousal acknowledgement bearing the name of Chairwoman Harmon has been identified as a questioned document. The signature does not match known exemplars. This matter has been referred to outside counsel for review. Rafferty leaned forward. "She's my wife. This is an obvious conflict." Delia spoke without raising her voice. "I was removed from every Crest file the moment we married. Your renewal applications were handled by independent officers without my involvement. What you're calling a conflict is actually a clean record, one I built specifically so that this moment would be unimpeachable." Vivica continued. "Loan proceeds across multiple accounts have been directed toward purposes inconsistent with the stated business objectives. Expenses coded as client hospitality, brand representation, and market development have been identified as personal expenditures connected to an individual whose initials appear repeatedly on internal approval forms." Rafferty looked toward the door. Yolanda was not in the room. She had not been invited. Harriet's voice came out smaller than usual. "This institution has had a long relationship with the Crest family." "Yes," Vivica said, "which is part of what makes the current irregularities serious. The history creates expectation. The documents violated it." Prescott cleared his throat. He slid his folder fully across the table to Vivica. "I would like to cooperate with the review," he said quietly. "I have supplementary records. I did not sign the questioned collateral documents, and I want that in the official record." Harriet said his name sharply. He did not look at her. "I'm sorry, Harriet. I won't be held responsible for paperwork I didn't produce." Rafferty turned to Delia. His voice dropped. 11 years of marriage compressed into a single question. "You're really doing this?" She looked at him steadily. "You put my name on a document I never signed. This was already done long before I walked into this room." He looked away. Vivica read the recommended actions without inflection. Harmon Meridian Trust would freeze all discretionary credit pending review. Emergency refinancing was declined. Immediate cure would be demanded on defaulted obligations. The questioned documents would be referred for legal review. Estate-backed facilities would be placed under default proceedings. Affected parties and insurers would be notified where required. Rafferty pushed back from the table. "If you freeze us, the company can't survive 30 days. Delia's voice stayed quiet. "Then it was already failing. You were borrowing against its survival, not building it." In front of her was the conflict disclosure form, the formal record that she had declared her interest, removed herself from the credit decision, and authorized the independent committee to proceed. She signed it with the upward T crossing her father had taught her when she was young, the same stroke that had proven the forged signature false. She set the pen down. "The review proceeds," Vivica said. The collapse that followed was not dramatic. It was administrative, which made it more final. Discretionary credit was frozen. The Hamilton project stalled within 2 weeks. A secondary lender who had been monitoring the situation issued a cross-default notice. Investors asked questions Rafferty could not answer without implicating himself or the people around him. Prescott's cooperation filled the gaps in the record that no one on Rafferty's side had wanted filled. Yolanda's lawyer negotiated quietly over the return of property charged to company accounts, the apartment in Yorkville, the wardrobe, the receipts. The pearls came back in a padded envelope marked as evidence. Not a trophy, not a crown, just a strand of freshwater beads connected to a line in a ledger. Harriet moved into a rented townhouse in Orangeville, while her lawyers argued over what remained of the Crest family trust. The Thornfield estate, pledged as secondary collateral on Rafferty's emergency credit facility, remained under court protection while the receivership completed its work. The house that had been her stage for 11 years was now an asset in a file folder. Rafferty called twice. Delia did not answer. Mara handled everything. When the divorce was finalized, the court found that the settlement, as originally drafted, had been designed to obscure Delia's legal rights, that the questioned document bearing her forged signature constituted a material attempt to interfere with those rights, and that Rafferty's financial conduct during the marriage had been deliberately concealed. The terms were rewritten accordingly. Delia did not use the outcome to speak publicly. She gave no interview. She made no post. She had never needed volume to be effective, and she saw no reason to acquire the habit now. What she did do, quietly, through the Harmon Family Trust's charitable arm, was establish a transition fund for the workers affected by Crest Development's collapse. Site workers, accounts coordinators, administrative staff, receptionists, people who had done their jobs correctly and were now facing uncertainty because the man whose name was on the building had borrowed against everything and built nothing that could stand on its own. The fund provided bridge support, job placement assistance, and emergency household grants, and it was not announced publicly. That was intentional. She returned to Thornfield once to sign a release order for personal property confirmed as hers that needed to be removed before the estate receivership completed its inventory. Edith, 61-year-old head housekeeper at Thornfield, and one of the few members of staff who had treated Delia's departure with open grief rather than careful neutrality, met her at the front door. Her eyes filled the moment she saw Delia walk up the stone steps. "Mrs. Crest," she began and then stopped herself. "Miss Harmon." Delia smiled. "Delia is fine." Inside, the house looked the same and felt different. Or perhaps she was different, and the house was simply showing her what it had always been. The east wing she had repainted. The maintenance schedules she had kept accurate for a decade. The chandelier in the entrance hall she had arranged to have properly rewired after discovering the original installation was a fire risk. None of it had ever been mentioned when people talked about what Rafferty had built. She stood in the entrance hall for a moment. She could reconstruct that evening from memory without trying. The gala behind the walls, Harriet's extended hand, Yolanda in the doorway wearing what was not hers to wear, Rafferty looking at the floor. The moment that had been arranged to break her, that had assumed she would leave with nothing, because they had decided she had nothing. She had not broken. She had simply gone somewhere they didn't know to follow her. Before she left, she walked through the small study off the main hall, where she had spent many late evenings reviewing documents. She stood at the window. The Caledon Hills were brown and grey under a December sky, open and unhurried in the way that landscape is when it has no interest in human drama. She thought about her father, about Saturday mornings in the trust office, about a lesson she had heard once as a young woman and needed 20 years to fully understand. He had told her, the most important thing a lending institution can protect is its own integrity, not the borrower's comfort, not the history of the relationship, the record. She had protected the record. She had kept the wall between marriage and money clean, not because Rafferty deserved it, but because the institution did. And when the moment arrived, the record had done the speaking, quietly, without apology, exactly the way she had taught herself to work. She picked up the last folder from the desk and walked to the door. Some women spend years being told they have nothing. What those years are, if anything, is a long and patient education in knowing exactly what they hold, and in understanding, finally, that they were never waiting to be given permission. They were only waiting for the right room. Delia Harmon walked out of Thornfield House, down the stone steps, and into the cold December air without looking back. The car was at the bottom of the drive. She got in. She put her father's pen in her bag, beside the documents, beside everything that was now hers to carry forward. And she drove toward everything she was about to build next.